At all time it was believed that women have no place in the war. However, the 20th century has shown that not only times have changed, but also views on it. Women and girls were and are in almost any army in the world. They did jobs as operators at communication hubs, nurses, doctors, messengers, and so on and so forth. And the war was no exception for representatives of the beautiful half of humanity who entered it as military personnel. Unfortunately, many of them did not escape the fate of being captured by the enemy. The Second World War in this part is very revealing. On the one hand, there were international rules for the treatment of prisoners of war. The Red Cross operated, and on the other hand, atrocities were sometimes so terrible that it is still impossible to comprehend. And we are certainly talking about how the Nazis treated women soldiers or resistance fighters they captured. Officially, for example, in Europe, there is practically no information about how the Germans actually treated captured French women, Poles, and even German women from the anti-fascist resistance. The fact that it was quite difficult to hide these facts of atrocities in Europe. Therefore, the Nazis tried in every possible way to conceal the crimes, especially in the face of representatives of the already mentioned Red Cross. Therefore, on the European continent, there was no doubt what to do with female prisoners. They were usually sent to concentration camps. However, the problem was who should be considered prisoners of war. If this was, for example, a corporal of the Belgian army, then everything was clear. But what if it was a partisan or an underground girl? So there was a legal incident that allowed the Germans to deal fairly freely with captured women. This means that they were free to do whatever they wanted. First, there is a lot of evidence of how girls and women were captured during partisan operations. For example, in Poland, when they merely disappeared without a trace. In other words, the fate of these patriots remained unknown. Perhaps they were simply killed, perhaps tortured or raped. One can only guess. However, the fates of those who ended up in the dungeons of Gestapo or concentration camps allow at least to a small extent to find out what awaited the women and girls who fell into the hands of the Nazis. In these dungeons, where no outsider could access, girls were tortured no less brutally than men. They were raped, beaten with rubber batons, various symbols and signs were branded on their bodies, their limbs were cut off, and so on. The list of savage tortures is endless. All this usually ended in execution. If the unfortunate woman did not die under torture, then, as a rule, she was expected to either be shot or hanged or beheaded on the guillotine. This may sound crazy, but it was probably the most humane way to be executed. The example of the suppression of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto can serve as a good confirmation of this. The fate of the captured female Jewish resistance fighters was terrible. Some were burned alive right in the dungeons of Ghetto. Some were shot. In a number of memoirs, surviving participants remembered that the Germans did not stand on ceremony with the Jewish fighters at all. Only the most lucky ones managed to get into concentration camps, or, as already mentioned, simply be shot. Some brutalized soldiers simply stabbed them with bayonets, cut their throats, and kicked to death. The same fate awaited the female fighters of the Polish resistance, Yugoslavia, and many others. In Yugoslavia, the Nazis did not just abuse the Serb female prisoners who had fought in the resistance. They turned their last moments of life into living hell. It was mainly the Croatian Hstory who, in addition to group and brutal rapes, arranged a terrible and painful death for the prisoners. Some were smashed in the head, others were beaten to death with clubs. There were cases of cutting off heads, arms, legs, chest, gouging eyes. Everything that could come to the mind of a sick fascist henchman was realized by the Hstory quickly and without delay. There are cases when Serbs, already exhausted by torture and humiliation, were tied to each other and thrown into the river, or simply drowned tying to a stone to their feet. Many were boiled alive. Some of them were skinned alive. This information actually circulates from time to time as part of the investigation into the process of the Serb genocide during Second World War. The fate of those female resistance fighters who ended up in concentration camps was also terrible. Along with other prisoners, they were beaten to death. Medical experiments were carried out, which ended in a painful death. Women prisoners of war were torn to pieces by dogs and burned in crematoria. True, it will not be fair to say that the Germans came up with some special execution specifically in the camps for the captured female fighters. During the occupation of the territories of the Soviet Union, especially in the initial stage after the attack on the USSR, the Germans also had many female prisoners of war. There were nurses, radio operators, and so on. Despite the direct orders to shoot females on the spot, ordinary soldiers did not intend to fulfill it. Many cases have been documented of how captured girls were raped to death, and if the victim did not die, they were either shot or stabbed with bayonets. In winter, the Nazi preferred to strip the girls naked and throw them out on the road, so that the unfortunate woman would freeze and die from the cold. Cases were recorded when girls were raped, then obscene inscriptions were cut out on their bodies with knives or bayonets, and the victims died from blood loss. One of the most terrible executions was committed on an unknown 19-year-old girl, a Red Army soldier whose body was discovered by Soviet comrades. The eyes of the unfortunate woman were gouged out, her chest was cut off, and she was impaled. The girl's hair was completely gray, which means that at the time of this barbaric execution, she was still alive. The most terrible were the executions of the sniper girls. The German called them silent death. For example, the hero of the Soviet Union, sniper Tatiana Baramzina, remained to cover her comrades. She was badly wounded and taken prisoner. After torture and bullying, the girl's chest was cut off, her eyes were gouged out, and then her head was shot with an anti-tank rifle. In the village of Saglievka, local residents witnessed how the Nazis executed a wounded Red Army girl. She was stripped naked and her eyes also were gouged out. After that, the prisoner was simply thrown into the snow and calmly waited for her to die from blood loss and hypothermia. No one knows how many girls died in dungeons from torture and bullying. Here we can recall the 17-year-old Zinaida Portnova. She fought as part of partisan detachment and was captured. Nobody knows what happened in the basement of the Gestapo, but a completely gray-haired and blind partisan was led to execution. Those girls who ended up in prisoner of war camps could die at any moment. And also often death was not quick, but long and painful. After being released, one of the former prisoners of war said that a captured girl of a Red Army soldier was brought to the camp of Drogovic. Her fate was both sad and horrible. Captain Stroll, the commandant of the camp, tried to rape her, but she resisted, after which the German soldiers, called by the captain, tied Yuda to a bunk. And in Milerovo, in the camp, a barrack for captured girls of servicemen was constantly visited by policemen who chose girls for themselves and for German soldiers. Those who refused were subject to torture. It was forbidden to shout. Without doubts, many girls died in terrible agony.